Greetings gamers, my name is Anto and today we're taking our first look at the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remaster and I'm going to be giving you my first impressions on the player core book. This video is sponsored by Chepeku Scenes, more on them later. Now I'm going to be breaking this video down into a few different sections, so use the timestamps down below to jump to the things you're most interested in, but let's dive straight into it. Now the first thing I want to cover is should you buy this? Now if you're an existing Pathfinder player, you're probably clicking on this video because you want to know whether I think you should buy the player core book, and the answer is no. This isn't a new edition of the game. The vast majority of the text in this book, I'd say probably 90%, is word for word identical to the text that was in the original core book. If you already own a copy of the PF2 core book, I don't think you're going to get your money's worth by picking up the remastered player core. I think you'd be better off just consulting the changes in the core preview document, which I'll link down below, and checking out Archives of Nethys for any other changes to the rules which have been made in this remaster. Now if you're brand new to Pathfinder 2nd Edition and don't already own the core books, then the player core should be your first purchase, as it contains everything that you need to know to learn the system and get started playing. And anytime I talk about the core rulebook in this video on my Getting Started with PF2 guide, you can now replace that with the player core book. With that out of the way, let's talk about the book itself, and I'm going to start with what I don't like about the book. I don't want to be accused of being a fanboy who has nothing bad to say about Pathfinder and only ever says good things. There are some things that I really don't like about this book, or I think that Paizo could have done better. And straight away, I think the table of contents in the old core book was much more friendly to new players in a lot of ways, because it gave summaries of the sections. The player core contents is more granular and utilitarian. It's much more useful as an actual page reference tool, but having those section descriptions was really nice for brand new players to kind of understand what that kind of part of the book was about, and losing that kind of takes away from the new player experience, which otherwise the player core book does a really good job of improving on the brand new player experience. Next up, while I think the layout and presentation of the player core and the remaster in general is a lot better than the original core books, there's still a lot that's kind of been left to be desired here. There's a weirdly large amount of orphan headers and widowed paragraphs and sentences throughout this book. Now, for a lot of people, you're not going to care about this. This is, I admit, something that someone who's particularly into layout really is going to care about a lot more than other people, but it does really disrupt the flow of reading the book in some places. There are some places where kind of that split across spreads, where you start a paragraph on one page and it jumps to another, really does kind of make it more difficult to read. And given that Paizo has done so much to make the reading experience better in other ways in the remaster, it's weird that they didn't address that and can either condense things or move the art around. In a lot of places you could just move the art around and it would have solved this problem. Now speaking of art, I think it's a real shame that Paizo doesn't include on-page credits for the artists throughout the book. This is the one area, and it's really the only area, that Wizards of the Coast actually do better than Paizo in terms of their book production. All of the latest Wizards of the Coast 5th edition D&D books include an artist credit on the page that tell you who has drawn or illustrated that piece of artwork, and it would be really nice if Paizo did that as well. And while we're talking about layout and theme and the kind of visual presentation of the book, I really want to mention the new character sheet. Now while it's a definite improvement over the original Pathfinder 2nd edition sheet, which is it's a mess, let's be frank, I still think it leaves a lot to be desired. It's still really dense and potentially off-putting to new players, and I hate the way the proficiencies are listed on the sheet. Having 4 boxes for proficiency next to pretty much everything on the sheet feels like such a waste of space. If you included a key on the sheet that tells the player how to work out proficiency, then you could cut 75% of those boxes and make the sheet much less visually overwhelming, free up space for more useful things like tracking your multiple attack penalty in the attack section, and just overall have a nicer viewing experience of the character sheet. It is better than the original, I'll give it that, but it's still bad enough that I look at it and I immediately think, I really want to make my own version of that, especially if I was going to run this for brand new players to TTRPGs. There's a lot on here that is going to overwhelm people when they first look at it that they really don't need to be overwhelmed by. And then speaking of making changes, while the remaster does an overall great job of removing a lot of the useless holdovers of D&D's history that serve like no purpose, such as ability scores, in favor of just having the modifier, there's one place where Paizo had the chance to make things a lot easier to understand, but I think they really missed the mark, and that's with partial ability boosts. Partial boosts are just so dumb. When the boost was tied to the base score, so it was harder to go from an 18 to a 20 than it was to go up to an 18. It kind of made sense to have the partial boosts to your ability modifiers, but now they've gotten rid of the base scores and they just have the modifiers. It's really weird to go, okay, you get +1 to each of these things as you go up, but once you get to a +4, if you want to go to a +5, you can't just do that. Why? Just why? It just feels even more arbitrary than before, and I'm not a fan of unfun rules that exist for not obvious reasons other than that's just the way it's always been. And the remaster has done a really good job of kind of stripping out a lot of the way it's always been stuff that has been held over from older D&D, and this really feels like an old shackle, kind of keeping it tied a little bit to that kind of history of D&D in a way that I just hate it. Okay, I just hate partial boosts. So that's my rant over about the negative things that have come up as I've been reading through the remaster. So let's go over the good stuff, and this is just going to be a bullet list of stuff that I made notes of as I was reading through this that I liked. So quick fire round. This video is sponsored by Icarus Scenes. Icarus have been a long time sponsor of the channel now, and I've talked a lot about their excellent battle maps in the past, but what happens during those narrative heavy sessions, the ones where you might not have a single combat but you still want something to show your players to keep them engaged and help them visualize the world? That's where Icarus Scenes comes in. These beautiful cinematic scenes help your players to understand what you're describing in game. It gives them something more immersive than a blank screen to look at, and it can be a great way to set the tone at the start of a social or exploration encounter. The Icarus Scenes Patreon is packed with these narrative scenes, many of which are inspired directly by existing Icarus battle maps, making for a perfect pairing, and you can get multiple variations for day or night, as well as animated scenes at the higher tiers for even better immersion. I'll leave a link to the Scenes Patreon down in the description below, and thanks again to Icarus for supporting the channel. First up, larger sidebars, and the new 2-column design means less text on the page, which means less text dense pages, which means that overall it is a book that is easier to read, which I really like. Again, from a new player perspective, when you're picking up the book, it makes it way easier to kind of get into this and understand what's going on in a book and pass all the information. Big fan of that. Similarly, the pages have a less weathered texture and less of that old-timey look, and a more clean and white in the background, which improves readability. I actually talked about something similar to this on Twitter recently, comparing D&D 4th and 5th edition, where I was looking at their readability and their presentation of information. And one thing that I really liked about 4th edition was clean white pages made it really easy to read that book. So I'm glad to see Pathfinder move away from the super heavily textured pages to something more clean and easy to pass. I really like that the key terms section has been spun out into its own 2-page spread with a distinct breakout box. Really useful for a new player to be able to go, right, okay, I'm going to open up this key terms page, bookmark it, and anytime that I get stuck as I'm reading through it, I can keep flipping back to it and understanding what these terms are referencing as I'm reading through it for the first time. Same with breakout boxes in general. They've gotten a little bit more distinct. I do think that the kind of trade dress of them, the graphic design of them, is less appealing to me personally. I think it's lost a little bit of its flavor, but it is more visually distinct, which I do think is more important. And the same in the example of play, which is on page 12 of the remaster, page 14 of the original. It's just much easier to read because more contrasting color choices, more distinct GM breakout boxes, and that's something that carries on throughout the whole book. In general, just much easier to read. I really like that there's no Age of Lost Omens section in this book, and that's been spun out into the GM core book. Personally, I play Pathfinder for its mechanics and not for its setting, so I don't like having all of the setting stuff take up page space in the core rulebook. I know that some people really want to play in the setting, and for them this will be a negative, but for me it was positive, and it helps shave off some of the page count in the player core, keep that page count lower, and mean that we don't have such a dense and meaty tome. It's almost like 200 pages smaller than the core rulebook was when Pathfinder 2nd edition first came out, so you could still probably kill a man with it, but it would, it'd take a little longer. There's a bunch of small quality of life referencing things throughout the book, like page references on the ancestry and class summary pages being included. Things like that are a really big plus. Same with the sidebar of the kind of bookmarks that's present on the right hand side of all of the pages. Really useful for understanding where you are in the book, what's coming up, where you are in relation to all the other rules. Really big fan of that. Another thing that I really like, the ditching of alignment. I know this was quite a controversial thing when it was first announced. I was never particularly bothered by it, but I like what they replaced it with, the edicts and anathema system. This is just a fancy version of always and never statements, which is something that I've talked about for a long time as being a great tool for building characters. So when you build a character, you give them an always and a never statement. My character will always do X. My character will never do X. And it's a really useful tool to contextualize how they react to certain things. You don't always have to follow the always. Breaking an always can be really interesting. Breaking a never can be really interesting. And it's great character development. And having that baked into the character creation from the start with edicts and anathema, I think is a much easier way to give new players some context of understand your character a little bit versus alignment. Because alignment is really nebulous, it's really open to interpretation, whereas making two statements about your characters, here's something your character will always strive to do, and here's something your character will strive to never do, is much easier for a new player to understand. Another really nice quality of life thing is having all of the previously advanced player guide stuff for the core classes and the core ancestries be baked into this right from the jump is really nice. So classes will get feats that used to be in the advanced player guide now come into the player core. So if you are playing a fighter, all of your fighter feats that would previously have been across two books are now in one. Just makes it much easier to pick up one book and go, oh, I've got everything that I reasonably need in this book. In terms of changes to the classes, I really like most of the changes, particularly the changes to the wizard. I think the wizard got a lot more thematic. I really, really like the new magic schools being built on scholarly institutes and getting kind of curriculum spells and all that stuff. It's a really flavorful change that I really like. Mechanically, yeah, it's not quite as good. You don't get quite as many spells out of it as you do in the old system, but I think that it helps identify the wizard as being much more of a learned spellcaster and helps move them into their own lane in terms of class identity, which I think is going to be really important as Paizo keep developing PF2 and keep moving forward. It's really going to be useful. A bunch more quality of life things like moving the equipment, but the quick equipment packs to the front of the equipment section, adding art for the equipment, more art for the equipment and armors and things being added to the equipment section. I'm a really big fan of, because one of my favorite things in old school D&D books was just poring over the art that was included alongside all of the equipment and going, oh, that looks cool, what is that? And then going finding the information for it and going, oh, I eventually want to get this item. So having more of that artwork there, really nice feature. Same with spell lists, it being 2 columns instead of 3, and having more clear tradition headings, really nice quality of life improvement, makes it much easier to read. And then when we get into the rules section on page 398, there's a good intro to the rules, and it's useful to help contextualize some of the terms that follow, and is a really good kind of onboarding for, hey, you've come to the start of the rules section. If this is your first time, here's some of the stuff that you need to know. Again, great for brand new players. So overall, most of my positive things to say about the book are how the book is physically laid out. It's very little to do with the content itself, because 90% of the content is exactly the same. It's just a few name changes and a few more substantial changes in a couple of the classes, and then spells being the big one. A lot of the spells have changed either in specific wording and slight mechanics, or some spells have been renamed and there's a couple of new spells. That's going to be the thing that I think takes the longest time for me to get used to, because I'm just getting used to the existing spell names, because there are so many of them. Having to relearn a lot of those spell names is going to take a little bit of time, but other than that, most of these changes are kind of technical, structural changes in how the book is physically laid out, how the information in the book is presented, and almost all of it is positive changes. There are a few things that I still think could use some improvements, some layout changes, some improvements to the character sheet, but for the most part, I'm really, really impressed with the remaster. It doesn't feel like a new edition, because it's not a new edition. It does just feel like really fancy errata, which is kind of what it is. As I said at the top of the video, if you already own the core rulebooks, don't bother buying these in physical form. Save your money for some other books. Just reference the changes in the archives of Nethys and the change document that I'll link below. But if you're brand new to Pathfinder 2nd edition, these remaster books are the books that you want to pick up first of all. And if you've been looking at Pathfinder 2nd edition, if you're a 5th edition player and you're wondering what the biggest differences are, check out this video where I go over all of the major differences between the two systems. But until next time, happy gaming.